Hello and welcome to the step-by-step Grasshopper tutorial on creating a sine wave pavilion. In this tutorial, we will be using Rhinoceros 3D and Grasshopper plugin to create a stunning pavilion with a wave-like form. Okay, let's set up the Grasshopper interface. To get started, open Rhino and launch Grasshopper. You would see a green color ball on top of your Rhino screen and you simply select it. This is how the interface looks like. This is called a component. This is called a number slider. And this is the output. So you simply select the input and connect it to the output of the component here, which becomes the input to your component to the second. Then you connect the output, that is the arc, to the geometry of the component, which is called custom preview. And you would be able to see on the Rhino screen that there is an arc created. Just to quickly recap, this is called the number slider, this is called the component, and this is the output geometry. So the first step is to make the base for your structure. Imagine this is an arc and you're dividing this arc into various points. Once you do that, you would be having polylines that control the curvature of your pavilion. So let's get started. I would start with the component called arc to form the base of the structure and then divide this arc into various points. This is called the number slider. And I would insert this into the input of the component called arc. Once I do that, I would be seeing some changes on my Rhino screen. Let's change 60. And this say. Once I make any changes on my Rhino screen, on my Grasshopper screen, I would quickly see the results on my, just like you see right now. The next step is to divide this curve into various points. If I want to add the number of points on the curve, I would simply add a number slider with the number of counts I want my points to be, and then connect it to the count component of the divide curve. Once I do that, I would be able to control the amount of points I want on my curve. Say I set it to 75. The next step is to deconstruct this curve into X, Y, and Z direction. So now this curve is only in X and Y direction, but I also wanted to have a verticality to it. So I would divide these points into a dimension that gives my structure a height. So to do that, I would be typing in the command called deconstruct and use the output of the divide curve component and add it to the input of the deconstruct component. The next step would be to storing the data from each of these into another component called construct point. So the X goes into the X coordinate, the Y goes in the Y coordinate, but the Z component cannot go to the Z coordinate because it needs to first have a height. So what I would be doing is divide them into a list. And store it in a list. The difference between these two components if you see, the data from the Z component that is stored in the list length gets stored as one unified group, whereas in series, it gets divided into several groups. So I would be connecting the list to the count. So now that you see, we have 75 points on this curve. If I were to change the direction of this, I would see that the panel is storing 49 individual points instead of grouping them all together into one component. So let's change this back to 7. Okay. So the next step is when we use Graph Mapper to give these points a direction. So I want my pavilion to have a curve like this. And in order to get this, I would be using a component called Graph Mapper to increase the dimension in the vertical aspect. To do that, I would be typing in the component called Graph Mapper. And the Graph Mapper looks empty right now. So I would be right-clicking it, changing the graph type to sine curve. The next step would be simply to just connect the series into the curve. You see no results on the Rhino screen right now. It's because the dimension here says that it's 0 to the ratio of 1. We would right-click here and double-click on the X component to change it to, say, 15 feet as your X and say 7.5 for your Y direction. Once I do that, I would be selecting this point here and moving a direction. I see no change again. It's because this output is not connected to any of the components right now. Once I connect it to the X coordinate, I would be seeing a result something like this. Now, since these are individual points with no curves in the X coordinate, I would be using the component called NURBS curve and connect it to vertices to give a direction to those points to make them a curve. This is the first step of making the baseline for the pavilion. I would select all that I've written so far, right-click and make them a group. I would simply copy-paste this into 3 other curves by pressing Alt and dragging it. Once I do that, I would have 3 curves to manipulate in my structure. The next step is going to be when I will be changing the number sliders for the other 2 curves. So say, for example, this is 45, this remains as 67. And this, the third curve could be 7. So these are some random numbers that I'm inserting to the arc to have a variation in how my geometry is going to look like in the end. So this was the first step to making the curves in the X, Y, and Z direction. The next step is when I would be lofting. So on the screen, what you see right now is simply these 3 curves, but it does not have a surface yet. So the next step would be to add a surface. To add a surface to the loft component, I would just select the curves into the input of the loft component. Once I do that, I see there is a difference in how my Rhino screen is looking. You can also play around with this component by selecting the curve in different order. So if I choose this curve first, which is the curve in this direction, and then the middle curve, which is this one, and then the outermost curve, I see a structure like this. Okay. This is how you add a surface to those curves. Okay. So the next step is we have this geometry with a surface, but this is not so practical, right? So what we want to do now is to have these divisions in the y direction. So something similar to this, so that it has y direction geometries that's supporting the entire structure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the curve again. And I'll repeat this for all the 3 curves that I have. So I'll copy this, I'll paste by Control C, Control V, and I'll just insert these curves into it. Once I divide these, the next step is that I add the number of divisions that I need. So say, for example, 300 for this, and 300 for this one. So you see that the curve has been divided into 300 equal points. And we repeat the same step that we've previously done. We use the line component here, and then connect these two starting and ending points to see that it's creating a line between those 2 points on the curve that we previously selected. So just look out at what's happening on the Grasshopper and the Rhino screen when I'm selecting each component. So this is the first curve that I've divided. This is the second curve that I've divided. And this is the line that has been created because it's merging those two into one component. So let's do the same for these two as well. So this is the outermost curve, and this is the innermost curve. So I want a line between the middle curve and the outermost curve. So I'm going to use this as my start point and this as my end point. Once I do that, I see that this line has been created between the outermost and the middlemost. Okay, so the next step is simply to merge them into one component so that I can control it simultaneously. And then I would simply give it a thickness by using the pipe command and give it a radius of say 0.1. You see, this line now has a thickness in the form of a pipe, and I can reduce it and increase it based on my design. So I would be repeating the same step for the curve that I had initially designed, which are these curves, to give them a thickness as well. So first I'll use the merge component, zoom in here to add more data set here, and then I'll select this, the NURBS curve here, and then the third curve here, and I'll simply pipe it. Once I do that, I'll give it a thickness of 0.1 so that it looks unified. This is how my pavilion looks like. Now, if I want to play around with the geometry of this, I can simply change the sine curve on the graph mapper. You can have this here, something like this. And you see changes on your Rhino screen immediately as you do it. Something similar to this, or and then I can also change the number slider here to design according to my preference. I can change the number of counts. I can also play around with this to see how many I want in the Y direction. And the last and the final step is you just bake all of these to get them on Grasshopper, on Rhino, I'm sorry. So I would right click here and you select the bake command, and I would select group and say, okay. So if I do that, I would be able to see that my geometry has been imported to Rhino. I would be baking loft. I would be baking these pipes. Right click, choose bake, and group it. And I would also group bake this one. So once I do that, I would be saving my script. Just make sure that you're saving your Grasshopper and Rhino separately, because it does not unify as one single file. So once I do that, I can select the entire thing, go to rendered mode to see how my structure looks like. So let me just close it. This is how my structure would look like in the end. Now that you see that the pavilion looks very simple, what I would be doing here is add a bonus step to make it more interesting. I would use the command called move, give it a direction of unit Z, that is in the vertical axis, and then say I insert a factor of 6 here, and I repeat the same step of pipe. I add the output of geometry to the input of the pipe command, and then I give it a radius of 0.1. And then it's up to me to choose which knob curve do I want to use for my move command. So say, for example, I use the outermost curve here. I insert that into the input of the move command, and I see that a line or a curve has been created in the Z direction, which is here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat this step right here. So I'll divide the curve first. I need to divide the curve into 300 segments. Once I do that, I can see that the moved curve has been divided into 300 equal parts, and I will simply merge them using the line component. So I want to make a line between this outermost curve and the move geometry that I have. So this is the outermost curve. I would use that as my start point and the move geometry as my endpoint. Once I do that, you would see that the move geometry now has the same form as these. So we would go ahead and use the pipe command, add the curves to it, and give it a thickness. You see how the pavilion now looks like? And you can repeat the same step just select everything and group them and just copy paste this by pressing Alt and dragging it. And now change the move geometry curve. So since this is getting moved from the outermost curve, now let's try it from the innermost curve. So if I select this, I know that this is the innermost curve that's getting selected on the Rhino screen. So I'm going to bring this to my move geometry here. Oops. And you see something interesting comes from the output of this. Now, you need to render all of these on Rhino. If you select your script here, you would be seeing what all objects have been selected on Rhino, but these are not in Rhino currently. They are just as a viewing interface. So in order to get your design on Rhino, what you got to do is you'll right click on the component and bake it. And what you got to do is you just simply select group yes, please, and click OK. Once you do that, you would see that the component has been baked. And now you can play around with giving them materiality. So I'll go ahead and bake this. I'll bake this one. Yes, please. And then I'll bake these. I'll also bake my other pipe that I had designed. And I'll bake the lofted surface. Yes, that's pretty much it. So once I have everything baked, what I can do is I can select the group and assign it a material. So for example, I go to this material palette here and give it a material, say this. And for the loft, I would use a material, say this one. Let's look how it's going to be seen as. You see how your structure now looks different? You can play around all of those parameters to see how do you want your surface or your pavilion to look like.